So about 10 years ago, I was driving across the continental United States, and I was passing through southern Montana, and on the way between two cities that was a very great distance, I stopped at a rest station to recuperate and use the restroom, and as I pulled up, I noticed that the other motorists who had stopped there were all paused around the restrooms and not going in at all, and when I opened the door and took a look, I saw that, in fact, a large American bison had wandered up out of the surrounding area, which was all open, mountainous land. It had come up and it had planted itself right in between the entrance to the restrooms and the parking lot. Now, I imagine a lot of people haven't seen an American bison in the wild. Certainly, I hadn't at that stage. I was a city person. I never had seen an American bison in my life. But these are huge, hulking animals. They're like big bulls, but much more intimidating. They're quite dangerous, too. You'll see signs all around these stops and parks in Montana. Do not approach the bison. And people have been killed by these things. And of course, when you're right in front of one, you don't want to mess with it. These things are wild animals. And of course, everyone still wanted to use the restroom, but there was this creature there. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't eating. He was just looking at all the humans and doing nothing else. And every few seconds, as someone sort of inched in, he would emit this sort of low bovine groan, really guttural. And then everyone would step back again. And this was going on for about 15 minutes, and people were getting quite frustrated. This was one of the few stops for the restroom in a given number of miles on this stretch of highway. And people were frustrated that this thing was obstructing their access. And no one really knew what to do, too. You could tell people were kind of working it out. You know, is it worth waiting it out here and having a staring contest with this American bison? Should we really just get back into our cars and drive another hour, holding it all in until we get to the next town? It was a ridiculous situation until, and I know no one's going to believe this, but it happened. This Ford pickup truck pulls in with the horse trailer. The door opens up, and this cowboy steps out. I mean, he's geared up. He's got the leather hat and the jacket and the jeans. And he just walks straight at the bison. Like nothing was happening. And the bison takes one look at him, and he just saunters off. After staying there for about 20 minutes. And it was just amazing. The guy acted like nothing was happening. No fear of the bison. And immediately, the animal just left. I remember replaying this episode in my mind after it happened, trying to figure out why exactly the events had played out. I mean, there's no reason for the bison to just occupy that space for as long as he did. There was no food there for him to eat. It wasn't some territory. There weren't other bison there. And yet, despite being aggressive for quite a long time, as soon as a confrontation began, he just immediately left the scene. And I realized that this is sort of a common instinct among animals to just be attracted to situations where they can exert control, even over situations that have no benefit to them directly. It's just a natural desire for trolling. And I think it was this situation that was playing through my mind all this week when I saw the videos uploaded by Kristi Winters. This is trolling. Those of you who've been following this channel for the few months it's been relatively active have known that I made a video previously talking about Kristi Winters' research and trying to be more or less open to a conversation with people who followed her and intellectuals like her, sociologists who did research. And I did give some critiques of the research she did and the methodology she proposed in her introduction, but at the same time I was hoping that this would evolve into a conversation. But at this point, I've come to believe that Kristi Winters is not only ideologically driven, but not interested in honest conversation whatsoever. And this has been confirmed by her absolute silence towards her critics and her responses to other things. I mean, there were legitimate questions we raised about how you can quantify the issues she brings up, and these were entirely ignored. But then I turn on my YouTube channel and see this video posted by Kristi Winters as a response to her critics. I mean, first of all, the music. Is there anything more smug than this xylophone track playing with the snare drum? It seems custom built to be the background to a kind of I told you so video. Now, at first this seems hopeful. Maybe she's trying to start a discussion. But then you see the next question. And right away we see something wrong. List all the nations that constitute the West. I mean, this is something that nobody can do thoroughly, and there's always going to be gray areas. It's needlessly pedantic. And so it continues. And here we get the real beginning of the irony. And this is the very quantitative approach that people have been asking her for. And yet now she's turning around and saying, well, how about you provide me with quantitative studies? I mean, presumably she's the scientist, right? But it gets worse. And now the pedantry becomes almost comical. Write the exact day that women achieved equality by your metric. I mean, this is ridiculous. When do social sciences ever have that kind of resolution? You'd be happy if you could locate something like this within a year. But of course, Kristi isn't done there. Now we have truly entered the realm of ridiculous. Not only should total amateurs be able to dredge up an exact list of countries that are Western by number of statistics, they should also be able to define rigorously a metric for measuring patriarchy, and then through their own research locate the exact day in every single country listed that each country achieved equality by this metric. And this should be easy, and it should all be consistently done by the same metric. I mean, it would take a team of researchers years to accomplish this kind of research project, and she's asking for it up front. Now, of course, I read this, and I was thinking, oh, okay, perhaps this isn't as bad as it seems. Kristi is obviously making this a joke. She's showing that maybe the entire question of equality is just something that we shouldn't have to ask rigorous data-driven questions about. She's demonstrating how hard it is to do and why it's unreasonable to ask this question with an expectation of a quantitative answer. And I mean, this would be a reasonable perspective. If this is a soft field and not scientific, then it should be reasonable to say, okay, this is too hard of a question, we can't use these rigorous means. But if Kristi were to say that, then she would have to acknowledge that people who felt subjectively and through more limited means that the West had achieved equality by whatever definition they want to use, she would have to acknowledge that that would be a legitimate perspective. But she doesn't acknowledge that this is a legitimate perspective. She derides it continuously on her channel. So I'm left believing that Kristi Winters thinks that this very, very rigorous, very, very detailed standard for describing equality is the only legitimate means to determine this question, and that her research has achieved this while her critics, be they amateurs, have not been able to reach this level of rigor, and therefore can be legitimately discounted as not intellectual or worthy of a response. But it's so obvious that Kristi Winters' own research doesn't live up to these standards. Just take the consistency principle. Just take the consistency of the answers about the definition of equality. She says in order for the perspective of her opponents to be correct, all the definitions have to be identical. That's her standard. And so it would be reasonable to say that on her side, all the definitions of equality or patriarchy should be relatively the same. Now, last video I did about Kristi Winters, I put up her definition of patriarchy, and I pointed out how many different ways there might be of interpreting it, and I questioned whether everyone in the field was actually using the same definition of patriarchy. But then I looked at Kristi Winters' series on patriarchy, because in every single episode of that series, she defines patriarchy and ways to measure it. And on every single episode of that one web series, she gives a different definition of patriarchy and a different method by which to measure it. Heck, I'll run through them right now. In Evidence That Patriarchy is a Real Thing, Part 1, she defines patriarchy as a social system in which power is held by men through cultural norms and customs that favor men and withhold opportunity from women. In Part 2 of the series, because she's trying to demonstrate quantitative methods, she defines patriarchy as a sliding scale that measures the percentage of a governing structure that's run by men. In her section on biblical patriarchy, Kristi describes biblical patriarchy as a phenomenon purely in evangelical Christianity that concerns the governance of family institutions. But then, in the very next video concerning biblical patriarchy, she changes the definition to be largely about homosexuality and the fact that male victims can't be recognized. Finally, in the last video of the series, Kristi discards any pretension of being non-biased and uses a definition of patriarchy that describes it as the society which we live in today. You heard that right. A video that's explaining why we should believe in patriarchy in our current society is using a definition of patriarchy that defines it as the society that we live in. It's completely circular and completely activist. And I know what the defenders of Kristi Winters are going to say. Oh, well, there's different contexts for patriarchy. It's more or less the same definition with just some slight tweaking to make the context more amenable to the analysis. Well, no, not really. Because even if we leave aside the last case, which is completely circular, the individual definitions contradict each other. In the first definition, patriarchy is defined as a situation that benefits men at the expense of women, whereas later definitions call out the fact that patriarchy leads society to ignore male victims, which contradicts the original definition. It's totally inconsistent. I mean, this is not done without foreknowledge. Kristi is making these videos as part of one unified series. She could just copy her slides with the definitions over and over and over again and maintain consistency and maintain actual integrity of the analysis. You can't have a variety of different evidences proving the existence of a concept that has a constantly changing definition. It doesn't work. I mean, this definition doesn't even meet the basic standards for coherency, let alone the incredibly high standards she set for mutual agreement among strangers that don't even know each other or are working together. And of course, after pondering this a little longer, I could only come to one conclusion. Kristi Winters doesn't care about this. She doesn't care about these questions at all. She's just an activist. Her scientific pretensions are simply trolling. And it hurts me to see people who've watched her video and they're actually trying to answer this question in good faith. They're actually trying to look up research, like this question is designed to start some kind of conversation. It's not designed to start some kind of conversation. It's just designed to waste your time. It's just a power play. And it hurts me to think that someone who's been trained as an academic could be this dishonest. Now, I know Justicar has looked into her research and has pointed out to me that a lot of even the published research has enormous problems with sample size, inconsistency, and good methods that account for geographic distinctions. Now, it's not my particular finding, so I'll let him present it. I hope he makes a video. But still, what this indicates is a person in Kristi Winters, and she's not unique, but an academic that cares very, very little about what's true. She only cares about being right. And we shouldn't engage with this person like she's some legitimate person we can have a conversation with. She's just out there to waste our time, to get us tied up so that she can laugh at our attempts to meet her standards and advance her own political agenda. And I know this is hard for many people in the skeptic and atheist community on YouTube because the academy and the sciences are built up as this big, large thing that you better respect or you're going to get smacked down. It's really the last respectable source for authority. And this is one of the reasons why it's so easy to use this authority against people who want to have an honest conversation. That's exactly what's going on here. And I'm reminded again of the story that I used to kick off this discussion of the bison standing in front of the restroom. It had no reason to be there. It had no real survival reason to block people, but it was a power play. And as long as the fear of its size existed in those people around it, it could exert that power. It's trolling, plain and simple. Now, I guess to finish, we can ask, well, what do we do about this trolling? And the typical answer is, well, you ignore trolls. And to a certain extent, that works very well. But in the case of academics, we really can't. They're standing in front of something we need to have access to, namely the education and the communication of new ideas to a general population. This is the really depressing thing about the situation, but regardless of how the debates go on YouTube, people like Sargon of Akkad and the Justicar are going to go back to their YouTube channels with a very, very limited reach and influence on the culture, whereas people like Kristi Winters are going to go back to being the primary educators of the majority of young Americans. That's just the facts of the matter. So I suppose the only real avenue left open to us is to try to ignore the trolls while simultaneously trying to make independent appeals to their audience. We need to try to circumvent them in some way. We need to try to reach out to the progressive community. That's a hard task ahead of us, but we need to start somewhere.